Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Debate Hub. I am Cheshire, your lovely host and master debater. I have with me today Chris Shelton back and Dapper Dinosaur, and I'm excited to have both of them. Today, we are going to be talking about brainwashing and how can you recognize if you've been brainwashed. Over on Dapper's channel, we talked about we did one of those reading tracts, and they were talking about how that's how it came up, right? It was about brainwashing, and but they didn't actually
Yeah,
explain
the
what
tractor.
brainwashing was. They didn't give us any kind of definition. They gave us nothing. Big stinking
And
lump of
ironically,
nothing.
if anything, the track that was warning you about have you been brainwashed was itself basically trying to brainwash you into being an anti-science religious extremist. So, yeah, we figured maybe that would be a fun thing to talk about.
Yeah, so I reached out to Chris while we were live on that show and was like, hey, you want to come talk to us about this? And I think this applies a little
Yeah,
bit to
absolutely.
deconversion a little bit too, because to deconvert from anything, you need to know you're in it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So,
And
what
that, I mean,
are
that's not even just a
Well, it's
religion thing.
only
That's politics, business.
yes.
There's MLMs that act like that. So, yeah.
it's only brainwashing when they do it.
Oh,
When we're
Right.
doing it, we're just teaching.
right,
We're just
right.
educating. We're just
So,
doing our research.
so what is the difference between brainwashing somebody and educating somebody then?
Well, it has to do. There's a sort of a spectrum of influence that you can sort of plot this on, and it really has more to do with peer pressure, social pressures, and environmental pressures on the person to conform, be loyal, believe, or there will be consequences. Education, doesn't put there that if you do not learn this thing or you do not agree with this thing, then there will be, you will be abused or you will suffer painful consequences for that. That's kind of the biggest key difference from the right off the top.
Well, I would give a little bit of pushback on that and say that, I mean, a lot
Mhm.
of people have grown up with people saying, like, if you don't go to college and you don't do well, there will be negative consequences as to like your job, your work, your livelihood. So
Yeah,
would that count along in that spectrum,
yeah.
or is that like it's not the science specifically telling you that?
No, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Is when you're lying to somebody about the consequences of a thing, then that could becomes a problem because then you're setting up false conditions, and it's not necessarily true that if you don't go to college you won't be successful. So that line is itself a lie, and therefore falls into a more sort of not good. I don't want to go all the way over to it's evil, but it's not good to be telling people stuff like that.
I mean, I fall
And
under the
it does push them into, decision making that might not necessarily be good for them.
well, there's something to be said about whether or not, like, how you even measure success. Because if you tell somebody, well, you're not going to be successful if you don't, well, how are you measuring success? Because that's something you kind
Mhm.
of, as a child, you get told what success is, and you kind of, as you develop into an adult, start to learn what you think success is, and that's liable to be all over the place.
Well, exactly,
Yeah, no,
which
I
has a
agree.
lot to do with why this is such a relative point because what's one person's brainwashing is another person's education, et cetera. So what I'm trying to do is sort of amp up the consequential aspect of that because that's part of why a person might feel compelled to believe or go along with something that they don't really agree with or feel that they're really on board with, but they feel compelled to be part of it or be loyal to it or whatever because of these drastic consequences if they don't. And when those statements that they're agreeing to are not necessarily objectively true, then you have influence going on there.
So now both of you have gone to university and college, correct? I believe you both have at this point.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I have a degree in history.
And now, Dapper, we won't get into your specific age because you're an ancient dinosaur. But if I
Right.
recall, you went to school when you were a little bit younger, right?
Yes, a little bit younger than I am now, but not by much because, when you're about 150 million years old, what's a few decades?
It's a little bit relative. And Chris, did you go when you were like more adult when you went to college? You didn't go right out of high school.
No, I graduated my university program this year.
So,
congratulations.
So I think there's
Thank
a
you.
really big difference in the way that influence pushes a person based on their age, right? Because I
Mhm.
dropped out twice, and I went right out of high school. So
Mhm.
and there's like a big to me that seems like that's the social pressures and the pressures of your family are going to be more, or like whatever's around you is going to be more or less depending on like where you are in life, right?
Absolutely. Context is king, always.
Do you guys think that what are like when it comes to recognizing if you've been brainwashed, because a lot of the times it's easy to look at somebody and point fingers, but to have like that internal reflection, what do you guys think is like some key red flags you could look for?
From
Well,
yourself?
Yeah, like if you're trying to recognize if
Okay.
you've been brainwashed specifically, because I mean, like I said, pointing out a log and or pointing out a what there's a Bible verse for that, right? Where you like look at the twig in somebody else's eye
Oh
while you
yeah,
got a log in yours.
before you take the speck out of your brother's eye or something, take the plank out of your own eye is roughly what it's going for.
Mm.
Which is like, you,
right.
it's easy to nitpick other people and it's also easy to ignore giant problems with your own character, which is true.
Yep.
We all like
Yep.
to think very highly of ourselves. So I'll let Chris go on about like how to recognize brainwashing in yourself, and if I have something, I'll add that into.
Well, it's a tough question because it requires a great degree of self-awareness. And unfortunately, a lot of people I've found over the years in trying to teach critical thinking to people on my channel, they're not even interested enough to watch it or look into it because they think their thinking is fine. It's everybody else's thinking that's the problem. And if everybody else would just get on the same page they are, then the world would be great, And everybody kind of has this approach to it. It's as Dapper was just mentioning, it's ego, kind of writ large. So the for me, unfortunately, the best advice I have on this is also some of the most difficult, which is that you really have to swallow, a dose of humility and be willing to examine your own ideas and beliefs a little critically, and that is very, very hard. And unfortunately, almost impossible for somebody who's gone so far down the influence spectrum that they're at what we would call, propagandized or brainwashed, or they're at the extreme ends of those spectrums of belief.
I think the
So,
term you used was radicalized earlier.
well, radicalized is when violence comes into the picture and justified violence, right? I use that term, and I believe that's generally used very specifically in that sense. But extremism, you can have an extremism of belief without becoming radicalized. They're bosom buddies, but one is not the other.
It's a very specific line of demarcation.
Yeah, it's like, God is good, but now God told me to smite you and I'm going to, come and hit you with a baseball bat. Those are two
Right.
different levels of extremity, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, would you say that let's say you are able to you're not too far gone. You can still you can still be reached by getting like a big old mirror plunked in front of your face. When you're looking at yourself, what do you look for?
Well, what are the things you can't question, right? What are the things you accept unconditionally? What is always true? That's really, I mean, if you're really going to kind of get to the brass tacks of it, it's really what does an extremity of belief even mean? It means that it's an unquestionable assumption or belief or idea. It can't be it's not susceptible to skepticism or criticism or examination. And those are the most deep-seated and most powerful influencers that can exist in us because we're not questioning them. And whether that is epitomized by an individual, like a politician or a religious leader, or some other authority figure a person has, or it's epitomized by a dogma or a book or a belief set, people invest. And the other half of this is the emotional investment that they bring because of their own emotional needs. Different ideas fulfill different needs for people. And that's again where that kind of self-awareness comes in of, well, what are my needs? What is it that fulfills me? And how does this belief or idea, meet those criteria, meet that demand that I have.
Yeah.
And that's why interventions and other people and questioning and stuff like that is usually so necessary to get a person jolted to start questioning, is because they're not gonna do it themselves.
Right. I noticed this a little bit online where people essentially go online to seek out validation from people who already agree with them. So
Oh yeah.
things
yeah.
like, particularly when it comes to politics, particularly comes to things like currently Elon Musk. Like, you really think Elon Musk is tweeting so much right now because he believes that he's correct and winning? No, he's looking for as much validation as he can get.
Yeah, he was just forced to buy a company he didn't want. He's coping hard right now.
He's coping hard, and it's one of those things where it's but there are people who are willing to validate him in his decision making and his big old mess up. So and like, you're always going to find that, especially when you've got a really large platform or you've got a really large area to look for. Like, the internet's a big place, so you're going to find people that agree with you if you look hard enough. So
that's right. That's right. Well, the weakness
really
of the narcissist is that they want so badly to believe the fan base that they go all in on it, right? And, I mean, it's not just narcissists. Everybody's kind of susceptible to this. It's kind of the danger of having a following and being a celebrity or public figure is you start believing your own bullshit, or you start believing theirs, and right. When you're constantly surrounded by yes men and sycophants and people telling you how great you are, after a while, you don't have any reason to believe you're not, because no one's challenging you.
So it seems like the two main things is, what can you question and what can't you question, and specifically, what can't you question and who's around you, like what is fulfilling you on an emotional standpoint. If you're getting fulfillment from strangers on the internet telling you you're right, that might be a red flag.
Well, exactly. But when you have a fragile ego, then you need anything you can get, and you're kind of a sponge for it, and that's the danger of being a narcissist, is you'll fall for that kind of thing.
Feline from the chat brought up an interesting point. They said, I also think it really helps to break a closed mind or brainwashed mind when learning multiple languages. Different cultures have different viewpoints, which leads to different experiences. I mean, travel, if you have the opportunity, do it. If you can do it, do it.
I don't know a better cure for nationalism than travel.
I imagine finding out there's more than just not America.
Yeah. What? Exactly. No. But also, it also helps. It also helps, with the positives as well as the negatives. I mean, there's an appreciation you get when you travel. For some of the things that we have here and some of the structures that we've built here, which is one of the reasons people want to come here. So there's the positive and the negative of that, but it's a well-rounded, it gives you more perspective. And if there's a key word here in brainwashing, it's you lose your perspective. It's one viewpoint, one perspective. This must be true. This must be right. And it cannot be questioned. And no matter what the dogma or the belief or the idea or the person is, if that's the space they occupy in your mind, you went too far.
Right. What was that you had, Dapper, about languages?
Oh, I was going to say, well, I do think that it's a good idea to learn other languages, and I do think that the fact that it can help you with having different patterns to your thought. I do want to say it's definitely not going to be a magic bullet to avoid brainwashing. There are plenty of people who speak many languages who still fall into brainwashing cults. I mean, look at say the Moonies. A lot of Moonies spoke more than one language, specifically because they had this international focus where they were going to be taking over Korea and the United States, and then from there on to the world. That was not sufficient to keep them from being brainwashed, because my goodness, the Moonies got very brainwashed. It's one of the more infamous brainwashing cults out there.
Why Korea?
Oh, because that's where Sun Myung Moon was from.
Oh, that's where it started.
Korea.
So.
Got it.
Yep.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's very true. I knew a lot of foreign-born Scientologists. Italy, Russian, Hungarian, Austrian, English, French. I mean, multiple languages, every one of them. But all those languages focused on a dogma that was not good for them.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything that's going to be necessarily the magic bullet. I have a
No.
habit that I do, and I think this helps me personally. I don't know if it would help other people, and you guys can kind of give me a lowdown if you think this is a useful thing or not, because this is something that I've just done for myself. And it is anytime I see something that I go, I reread it and I take some time to think about why I'm reacting that way to whatever it is that I'm looking at. And sometimes the reasons I'm reacting that way are very good. Sometimes they're like, yeah, no, that's awful. That's terrible. Get that thing away from me, and here's why it's terrible. Versus like as long as I can explain it out loud as to why it's the case. Right.
Mm-hmm. That's a
I
decent
think,
level of critical thinking and skepticism there.
yeah, it's that self-awareness. If you
Exactly.
don't, if you're not able to take a look at yourself and think, what am I doing? Am I doing the right thing? Am I reacting appropriately? Are my beliefs actually based on anything that I think is reasonable, or do I just believe it because that's what people are telling me I should? If you can't do that, it's going to be very hard for you to get away from any brainwashing influence you might be under. And also, it's going to be pretty easy for you to get to the point where you're being brainwashed, because that self-reflection is vitally important. People know that I was, for instance, young Earth creationism likes to brainwash people. There's a lot of threats that go into it, usually with things like, Armageddon, or your the eternal fate of your soul and whatnot. But still, when I was coming out of that and looking at it myself, I was like, yeah, this doesn't all add up. This isn't even internally consistent. Nor are they always telling the truth about things that I'm checking on, because I went to the naughty websites I wasn't supposed to go onto that talked about science.
Can't
Bad,
do
bad
that.
ever. No, not
Yeah.
okay. Um, so fortunately, though, like when I did get out of that and that became public, it wasn't the group. The church I was going to wasn't so severe that they were just like, "Well, we can't talk to him anymore." There were a whole lot of conversations about what I was doing and why I shouldn't be, and how wrong I was and all that. But it was not like, well, we're gonna shun him, and once he's 18, that's it. We're cutting him off from everything. So I guess I was lucky in that sense. But yeah, it's the
Yeah.
self awareness is key.
Do you
Well, it
guys?
is, and
Sorry,
there's
go ahead.
there's a couple points we haven't hit on yet, which I'll just bring up, and we can go wherever we're going to go with it. But there's also the emotional component, which is really really big, kind of super important, and the isolation aspect of this, or the sort
Yes.
of totalist thing that's necessary in order to really call it brainwashing versus, say, influence or education, or somebody talking to you about some ideas. I mean, you're not going to get brainwashed over a cup of coffee, right? But when somebody is able to control, isolate, manipulate your thoughts in a totalist way, in a way where you're not exposed to or have access to other ideas, or it's limited or policed or censored in some way, that's, I think, another aspect of the context of what is brainwashing, and what are we talking about there.
Yeah, I think that's why I find it a little bit. I mean, it makes sense from a propaganda line to say that going to college is going to brainwash you. But in
Right.
reality, it doesn't really make any sense, just because the whole point of going to college or going to university or going to an education area like that is that you have access to their entire library. Even if you don't agree with the
Right.
teacher that's there, that individual teacher is one of many, and you still have access to all of the other material.
Exactly.
It's just not
Exactly. And you're
accurate.
and you're there to pursue grades and get a degree. It's not a life or death matter. In other words, I mean, sure, in some future sense there is success or failure, but that's a variable road. There's no certainty there. It's not a matter of, well, you're going to conform with this dogma, or we're going to kill you. That's where we're talking. That's the level we're talking about when we're talking about brainwashing,
Yeah.
versus, say, some indoctrination or some propaganda.
Now, do you find that like an education, or like a background in education, or like an upper level of learning, like assists people in being able to avoid, like, does ignorance to, um, or a lack of education make people more susceptible or more likely to get pulled into sort of like a cult of any kind, whether it be a religious cult, whether it be a political cult, whether it be a personality cult?
You would think so, but no. Not really. The numbers don't really work out that way that I've seen. In fact, people of lesser cognitive ability, I'll say, right, have less ability to connect the dots, put things together. And so they're not necessarily as susceptible to at least, thought-based or idea-based brainwashing, as generally relies on a person's ability to connect dots and make and see things or justify or rationalize things. And that takes imagination and cognitive ability.
That's fascinating, because it basically just means that you could essentially break that down to saying like some people are just too dumb to be brainwashed. I am for that. I am for
basically,
that.
yeah. Now there's other means of brainwashing people that have nothing to do with ideas, right? You can sleep deprive, food deprive, physically abuse people, condition them, old behaviorist theory, that kind of thing, right? You can
Pavlov's
force
dog.
people. Oh yeah, you can do that. That works.
Stick and carrot.
It's not like we're above all that because we have frontal lobes. You deny somebody sleep long enough, you can make them think anything you want.
Yeah.
So, there's,
Nebulon makes an interesting point in the chat, and they said, quote, "College will destroy your children's values," end quote, PragerU. And I think we all agree that PragerU is like a propaganda machine, right? Like, I don't think there's...
Oh, yeah, yes. Absolutely is.
Okay, no question about that.
It's not even like a secret. Like, they're openly just like, this is conservative talking points and rhetoric. They're not even pretending to be a unit. I mean, let's be fair. They are self-aware about that.
That's right. Which is one of the reasons they're not as effective as they could be.
They could be doing it better.
Because deception is part and parcel of this whole picture too. At least when it gets to the culty propaganda, let's slide it in where you don't know what's even happening kind of thing. There's overt and there's covert tactics here.
I'm curious
to know. It's a big field. There's a lot to this.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And I'm curious to say, like, do you guys actually think that they have a point? Does college even talk about values? Because when I went, again, admittedly, I dropped out more than once, but when I was there, values wasn't really something being discussed except in philosophy class.
Yeah, I would say values are discussed. I mean, you certainly have ethics and morals and philosophy and stuff, but also in a case where my education covered domestic violence and human trafficking. I mean, we had to have some agreement on a moral foundation that, hey, maybe abuse is bad, right? Maybe overtly hurting people so that they'll repeat your rhetoric. Maybe that's not a good idea.
Maybe.
Yeah, right. So I think there's some value being brought there. When it comes to, are we talking about religious-based values or, culty-based values or ideological values? That's, I think, where we want the menu or the smorgasbord of ideas, being presented in a more open, tolerant way. And depending on which college you go to, you're going to have different experiences of that. Liberty University is going to give you a very different experience from Stanford.
Right.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
Because that is one of the things, right? Like, ideally, college isn't there to do things like brainwash you or have undue influence over you. But there are also some ideologically based colleges and universities that will, in fact, do that.
Exactly.
There are still colleges where you're not allowed to date someone of another race while you're there.
There are some colleges
at Liberty, you're not even allowed to date.
Not allowed to date at all. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. Well, at least it's not a race-based policy then. I guess you have that going for it.
Exactly. See, a lot of people will also, and I say a lot of people, I'm going to go in these generalities, but it's unfortunately true. A lot of people will come from a place where they have a very set value system, right? Whether it's rural America, whether it's, the cities, either way, you're coming from this different value base. And then you go somewhere, you send your kids somewhere, and they come back saying things that don't align with your value set. Oh my God, he's brainwashed.
Yeah.
Not really. Not at all. They've just been exposed to different ideas than what you're used to. And that's not brainwashing.
But to be fair, when my experience at university, and because I'm addressing the chat, my experience at university was a Christian university. So,
Oh,
so
I didn't know that.
maybe the
I'm sorry.
discussions on values were far more muted. And like I said, I was there for a very brief period. I was not there long enough. So like I said, my
Right.
experience there was probably not enough for me to even get to the point where values were being regularly discussed.
Right.
Hmm.
Well,
Hey,
that's
there's
the
something to
thing,
be said
right?
about
And
like business ethics if you're cut. Like I went to radio broadcast for a year, so dropped out of that too. That was regular college, and I mean there were values that were discussed, but they were more like business between your like clientele and what you were doing, not so much like values as like how you behave as a person.
right. Well, the very idea that there were different values kicking around of whatever kind on whatever table of discussion that we're being kicked around on
Mhm.
is indicative of the fact that you're in an area where thinking and speaking and talking and considering these different things, that's the antithesis of brainwashing. That's the exact opposite of it.
Right.
Right.
And so it's really hard to go into a context like that or a situation like that and go, oh, that's brainwashing. No, it's not. It's absolutely not. It's just something different from maybe what was there, what the person is bringing in, what they're bringing with them. And that's what you want. You want that variety of experience and ideas because it gets people thinking.
And that's
And
why
the
I think
more
it's
thinking a person's doing, the less brainwashed they are.
And that's why I think it's valuable to say, hey, I'm reacting this way to something. I think this thing is brainwashing. I think this thing is making me uncomfortable. Why is this thing making me uncomfortable? Because if you can explain why and your reasoning is not fallacious, it means that you've been able to self analyze and you can either throw away that reasoning or whatever it was that was making you feel that way and you no longer will feel that way about it, or you keep it and go, no, I don't like that. But at least you can explain why.
Exactly. You have choices, though. Right. And the thing about brainwashing is it's taking away your choices.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like the Pampers commercial. Buy Pampers or you don't care about your baby.
Wow. Yeah.
That's what it says. That's one of the
that would be in that direction.
One of my favorite things.
No, it's all about bounded, as Janja Lalich puts it, right? It's about bounded choice. It's binding your choices. It's limiting your choices, and it's putting you in the worst places, in the places that really are truly crazy making. It's giving you information that itself is self-contradictory. They're giving you mutually exclusive ideas that are we call those double binds. So you get trapped in them. You get trapped in them cognitively.
How does that apply to a two-party system in politics? Because
we
recently had an election.
No, that is seriously part of the problem. It's one of the reasons. It's kind of the elephant in the room that very few people actually bring up or talk about, but actually is one of the crazy making things about our system is we're only given two choices. And that can be crazy making when both choices suck.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that I've noticed over the past like couple elections. I'm Canadian, so fair. I'm not from America, so this doesn't affect me in the same way. It still does because I'm literally upstairs. But I find that the Democratic Party seems to be holding the elections hostage because vote for us or else is basically their platform. And
that's both platforms, though, I think. The Republicans do the same thing with their fan base.
Me too, yeah.
Really? Because I found that like the Republicans are at least pushing what they tell their party they want. Right? So
look, I've been subject to months worth of political ads from both sides recently.
You'll know better than I will.
And basically both sides are just saying, look at all the horrible things the other person wants. That's why you should vote for us. Although very often, because I'm me, whenever they tell me, look at the horrible thing that our opponent wants, I'm like, well, that sounds good to me. Maybe I should vote. Political ads very rarely entice me to vote for the candidate that they're an ad for. They usually do the opposite to me because, I don't know, I'm a contrary asshole. But still, it's all the GOP ads and the Democrat ads have pretty much, especially for the governor race here in Arizona, have just been like, oh, the Democrat wants to do these things, like we're going to open up the borders to all the drug lords in Mexico, and the Republican wants to, and then I think it was what was the big one? Oh, right. It was something like basically remove all reproductive rights from women. Which, to be fair, I think she does want to do that. So,
To be fair, that's
that won't
accurate.
actually, right?
Oh,
I mean,
no.
look, she is kind of on the record saying that men are better than women. So,
Oh, I mean, well, obviously.
yeah.
That's why
Despite that,
I'm
is-
the master debater.
Despite that, is still like I think less than 1 point behind in the current
Ooh.
election results so far. So, like, yeah.
But actual political opinions aside, from like a brainwashing and from a degree of like kind of breaking down what we're talking about and how to recognize that you're being either manipulated or your choices are being taken away, whether you agree with Republican or Democrat on either side, it seems to be that it's problematic.
Well, advertising and propaganda are just a daily diet of our life now. There's no getting away from that. And those things are not the brainwashing. The brainwashing is what happens to instill and enforce those ideas in the first place. The commercials just reinforce it or remind it or push it or sort of trigger it or activate it. But that's not the cause of it. You don't get radicalized by watching TV commercials, right? It's deeper than that, and it has to do with cultural influences, social influences, and emotional investment, in the message.
Well, I think we talked about
that's where they're getting you, is the emotional investment.
I think we also talked about isolation earlier, and
it's
how
part of it.
Being isolated can protect you in some ways, but can also be a huge detriment in others.
That's right. I mean, well, we see this with we were talking about older people, senior citizens, right? And how they can tend to live alone, sedentary lives, solitary kind of lives, or it's just them and their spouse, and they're sitting in front of the TV all day, and there's Fox News, and boy, if it's not entertaining, and then it becomes more than that, right? Then it becomes interesting, then it becomes fascinating, and then it becomes very important to your life to have this steady diet of this information, because you're being taught over time, you're being us versus them. You're being, these bad guys are being othered to you, and you're on the side of good, and this picture is being painted over time, and very sensationalist fear-mongering is being done over time, and you don't have anyone in that environment to question this narrative, to bring some skepticism to the picture, to say to you, hey, maybe there's this other fact you're not being told. That's not happening in that environment, and so there's this isolation that's happening there, which is a key part of coercive control.
Do you find that between TV and the internet, and people that have isolated themselves or are isolated, do you find that like some of these things are more or less helpful? Because it seems like they could really easily go any direction. Like you could get locked on Fox News, or you could get locked on like NBC, or you could get locked on
That's right.
And do you find having access to the internet has been helpful towards things like that? Or do you find it's because if we're talking about potentially senior citizens who are maybe not as computer literate, that the internet becomes more of a danger?
Well, I think the internet's more of a danger for everybody because of our natural tendency to engage in what we call confirmation bias. Right? We our side and their side ourselves automatically. Our brains just do it. We categorize. We who's the enemy, who's the ally. We're constantly working on those calculations, and so the internet gives us more freedom and ability to find and seek out alternate opinions or ideas, but our brains don't push us in that direction because we're instinctively always looking for reinforcement and our tribe, and when we're on the right side, and looking for information that confirms that. And that's the danger of the internet, is it allows you a lot more data points with which to reinforce your ideas. And if you and it's just that's the critical thinking and emotional intelligence aspect of this that's so missing out of the picture, is that people don't know that they really need to discipline themselves to go get a variety of viewpoints on a thing. They don't tend naturally to do that.
Do you think the younger generation is going to be better at that because they've grown up with things like Twitter and Facebook? They're a little bit more familiar on the pitfalls of it, or do you think they're going to be even more or less susceptible?
It seems to me that they're going to be more susceptible to that. Statistics seem to be pushed, seem to indicate that the more addicted, for lack of a better word, or more used to you are to living in a digital world only, you're negating and sort of ignoring the real world. And there is a real world, and it's not the digital world. And to the degree you can't even differentiate those two things or live competently in the real world, you're gonna be hampered in your life. And that's why I have a lot of attention on the sort of trance-inducing, addictive quality of the way we have structured our internet experience.
Yeah. I find that there's a really big difference in the type of rhetoric and the style of conversation that you find online versus what you're going to find at the bar. If you go to the bar to have a conversation with somebody and you're talking to somebody who is far more entrenched in their ideology, the conversation might be more aggressive or might be a little bit less pleasant of a conversation than somebody who's maybe a little less entrenched but disagrees. But very rarely do I ever see a conversation go beyond like a yelling or like a shouting match.
Well, exactly. How many times do you go to a bar with a friend of yours or go out to dinner or a social event and they say something that you disagree with and you just go, oh, you know what, libtard? F you, right? You're blocked. And then just turn around and walk away.
I'm going to say that next time.
Never hear or see from them again. Erase me out of your phone right now. You are never to contact me again. I mean, how often does that? It does, we don't do that socially, but we do that online multiple times a day. That's not good for relationships.
It's not good for fixing issues either.
It's so much easier to be rude across an anonymous screen where you can't see the other person. They're just some like profile picture, and you say things that are just so much more mean. And I mean, look, to some extent, maybe that's just more honest, right? Maybe that's actually what you're thinking when you're in these conversations. Because I know I've held back what I actually thought in real life conversations. But on the other hand, it's not going to, if your goal is to convince the other person that you're right, or even people who agree with them, just being a jerk isn't going to help. If you're trying to help people come to your point of view, it's profoundly unhelpful. It's one of the reasons why, like, on my channel, I try to keep things reasonably pleasant and cordial, even though many of the people that I'm discussing or many of the ideas I'm talking about are pretty horrible. It's because I want to at least have the opportunity to maybe reach people who don't currently agree with me. And even if they don't necessarily end up agreeing with me completely, at least going with, well, at least he's making reasonable points. It's something for me to think about. And I'll be honest, though, I do sometimes fail. There is one particular cult leader who I've stopped even trying to be polite about. Once he got a body count and endangering children, I stopped really caring about being nice to that particular person. So,
which one was it?
Other than that, though,
which one was it?
Oh, it was Kent. We all know it was Kent Hovind. It was Kent Hovind. Yeah. Who?
Right.
Well, he wasn't actually always a cult leader, but
well, if you want to talk about somebody who isolates people, if you want to talk about somebody who isolates people, takes advantage of people, who is it that works at Dinosaur Adventureland again? Felons and ex-cons that have nowhere else to go, that he doesn't actually pay, and they just live on the location.
Even the people who aren't ex-cons, he usually says, okay, well, this is your home as long as you want it. So you don't need that big bank account or that property. Why don't you sell it, donate it to the Lord's work, since you already have a permanent home here, except people's stay time on that compound tends to be measured in like a number of years you could count on one hand. And I say that as a dinosaur who only has like 3.5 fingers. So then people they're off the property now, and they don't have their assets. They can't really sue because it was a donation, right? Like that's what's on like the paperwork when they signed over all this stuff. And so, and the whole time, I mean, this is like a specific instance where there's brainwashing, right? So the whole time everyone's on there. There are constant quote unquote staff meetings there. And whenever anyone has any criticism for the leadership, by which we mean Kent, they're told things like, well, you don't disagree with the Lord's anointed. You don't want to be like Korah in Korah's rebellion back in Exodus, the person who rebelled against Moses and got like swallowed by the ground. Like, this is the kind of talk that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's the kind of isolation I'm talking about too, right? And again, social pressures, peer pressures, right? I mean, that's what creates that kind of environment. And it sucks. I mean, it's awful to be in that, because it really does come down to when you're starting to, you're not feeling any choices here. It's conformity, it's loyalty, it's go with the group, or there are going to be some really nasty consequences. And that's definitely a situation you want to get yourself out of, no matter what the belief set is. Look, it could be the most beautiful, let's give rainbows and butterflies and marshmallows to everybody, but if you're in a place where you can't question or even consider differing or opposing points of view, you got to run, not walk away from that.
I think this applies to YouTube channels. You'll see a lot of YouTube channels that if you question the person that is doing, and I mean question politely, I don't mean be an asshole, because if you're just being an asshole, you're gonna, nobody wants to have to deal with that while they're live or in their comment section. But if you're asking a legitimate question about whatever the conversation topic is, and you get like 7 people jumping down your throat, and then whoever is running the channel is just like, well, hey, let's pick on this one person that's disagreeing with me. And if they're legitimately addressing what you're saying versus if they're basically just using you as a punching bag to entertain the rest of their followers, or to
things that are meant to shut thinking down, not keep it going or encourage it, or let's have a lively debate here. They're trying to say things that are stopping you from communicating, not continue the conversation.
Would you say things like asking someone what their crimes are when they're criticizing you is one of these thought-stopping techniques? Because that's always how it's struck me.
Absolutely. Yes. That's exactly. It's rhetorical. It's a rhetorical accusation. It's not a real question.
Have you seen what the Quartering said? There's a guy named the
Quartering. No, because I don't watch the Quartering. Holy
shit. So this guy's got like a relatively large following on YouTube. He's one of those like cry-bully type people that's just like, I'm a white man, no black people allowed. But people, he said something along the lines of, and I talked about this on another video. He said something along the lines of somebody saying, why the hell are you defending Hitler? And he said, well, Hitler did this stuff. What have you done recently?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, my goodness.
Come on, man. Like, wow.
Guys, Hitler built a highway. That's cool. Like, okay, great.
Have you built a highway?
No, to be fair, I haven't.
Well, then who are you to question Hitler?
Good point. Good point. I got nothing, guys.
No criticizing Hitler here. Well, like, that's the kind of extremist response you would expect to get. I mean, I see the same thing from some of the Matt Dillahunty followers. Some of the people who follow Matt Dillahunty are not willing. Like, I was very nice to him when I looked at why he had left the ACA. And I was like, some of this makes sense. Some of this doesn't make sense. I don't know. I don't know the guy. But he decided to publicly put it out there. So I decided to take a look at it. But his followers could not handle like a legitimate just outsider view of the great Matt Dillahunty. It's so bizarre. It's been like 2 weeks and they're still in my comment section. They're mad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make Matt Dillahunty a good guy or a bad guy. That just means that whoever is following him have not learned like some of the good things that Matt Dillahunty has talked about, which has been critical thinking in the past.
Yeah. Actually, so this might be a bit of a pivot, but it's a question I have, and I'm curious about it. It's for Chris. So I know that people who join the Sea Org, there's obviously a lot of coercive control. You know, they're told where to live. They don't really have property. They sleep when they're allowed to. You know, they eat when they're allowed to. They're given essentially no money. All of this is a very obvious setup for some intense brainwashing. But what about public Scientologists. You're a guy, you've probably prepaid for a few blocks of auditing here and there. Are they actually being brainwashed in like to the same degree or to a lesser degree? What techniques are being used? Is there anything beyond just the, well, you already prepaid for 600 hours of auditing, you might as well get your money's worth?
Sure. Yeah, no, sunk cost fallacy is the least of it. What you have in Scientology is a series of psychologically manipulating techniques that are being executed against you as an individual without your knowledge or consent. And those techniques are leveraged against you in their counseling, or what they call auditing, which is a very far cry from counseling on a number of levels. For example, and this is every single public Scientologist, staff member, Sea Org member, all of them. In the world of Scientology, the auditing is the crucial ritual or component or practice that gets you free, that frees your spiritual awareness and ability. And you have to do it, and you have to do it for hundreds and hundreds of hours. And there's lots of different styles and kinds and approaches to auditing, but it all has what I call a coercive control framework built into it. For example, every single auditing session you go into, you're in that chair, the auditor is sitting in this chair, and the door out of that room is behind him. Or her.
You have to go past the auditor to get out.
And you ain't getting out of that room until the auditor says you are. Now, most of the time, that's not a big deal. Right. But some of the time, it's a very big deal. Because if you got to eat, go to the bathroom, don't like what's happening, don't agree anymore with what's being done to you, too bad. The auditor is the one who says when you get to leave. That would not happen. Yeah, you'd be physically restrained. That's why he sits there. That's the point. That is literally the point I'm making. And not only does the auditor do that, the auditor is a specific part of their training to become an auditor is learning how to do that, how to physically restrain you and keep you in your chair and put you there and keep you there. So that's baked into the technique. That's not some opinion I have. I can show you the written references where Hubbard says, this is what you do and this is how you treat somebody in an auditing session. So there isn't any other word for that but controlling, and dominating.
Right, yeah.
So that's baked in at every level of Scientology. And that's just one of about, I don't know. 20 or 30 different, subtle and not so subtle control mechanisms that are being leveraged against a person without their knowledge or consent. And that's where it goes off the rails.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that people would be physically restrained from leaving if they wanted to. That was news to me.
Well, and how much of that
it is to a lot of people.
And how much of that is excused and gotten away with because it's a religious practice?
Well, look, it's for your own good, right?
And that's the thing. It's all about the framing, because, and this is so crucial, this is so key to how people will agree to or allow themselves to be controlled or manipulated or isolated, all of the above, is because they're given a very good reason. Well, this is necessary in order to help you. We have to do this. It's not my choice. It's what Ron says. So this is what we're going to do. And look at all these stories and anecdotes of all these people who have had all these wins from this, and they had all of this success. So therefore, you're guaranteed to have the success if you cooperate. So sit down, shut up, and do what we tell you.
Now, that actually does bring up a question that I also have, which is with the gains, right? At certain levels, you're supposed to have certain gains that you get, like total ability to perfectly recall all past events or something from your life. And there's eventually things like basically you get to be Superman. And yet, from what I can tell, no Scientologists, public or otherwise, have very obviously manifested any of these particular spiritual superpowers. Does that, how does the brainwashing get past the fact that, hey, Tom Cruise can't fly as far as we can tell? He doesn't seem to have total control over matter, energy, space, and time. So what's the deal there?
Have you seen his movies?
Go there.
Right? I mean,
He's got
that's
editors,
kind
guys.
of how Tom Cruise thinks about his life. I mean, the man's about to go film in space. I mean, he's pretty on top of and in control of his life as far as he's concerned. But your point's not missed. I'm just being a little joking here.
Right,
but,
no, I get it.
but I'm making the point of confirmation bias. People believe what they want to believe, what they need to believe. And in Scientology, this manifests in lots of different ways, such as, well, I averted that storm, that hurricane that was about to strike Clearwater, somehow didn't. Why do you think that is? It was us, right? Oh, I found those keys. I got that job. Coincidences that mean nothing to anybody else mean everything to Scientologists because it's proof positive that they are manifesting spiritual powers by these good things happening to them in their life. And it's exactly the same as when you go see a psychic and you remember the hits and you forget the misses. They forget the 20 times they couldn't find their keys. They remember the one time they went, ding,
well,
there
because
they
the stars
are.
aligned that one time, and all you have to do is get it to do that again. And if it didn't happen again, that's a fault on you. You're not doing it right.
That's right. That's right. You know, and there's all kinds of excuses and rationalizations in any belief set, Scientology or otherwise, for failure, right? And it always has to do with your weaknesses. You weren't good enough, strong enough, hard enough. You didn't think positively enough. You didn't pray hard enough. You know, it's always back on you as to why it didn't work, because it's never the question that the cult leader's wrong, the system's wrong, or somehow the method is wrong. It's always you who didn't do it right. And when that is the logic present in any system, you are in a cult.
So how does that square? And I'm sorry to turn this specifically into Scientology, but I don't very often have a former Scientologist. Right. So how does the cult techniques are always the right thing, and you're the one who got it wrong? How does that square with the fact that, as far as I know, David Miscavige, who's in charge of Scientology, basically, has more than once said, "Oh no, we got all the training wrong. Everyone has to recertify for whether it be auditing levels or like you have to redo your OT levels or something, or you have to rebuy the course books because we found mistakes in the course books or whatever." So that seems like an open admission that, well, the techniques, we got it wrong. So maybe it wasn't you.
But they didn't, see, because but they didn't get it wrong. It was the transcriptionist, it was the secretary, it was the typist, it was the suppressive, sort of what's the term for it? I'm missing the phrase right now, but it's the bad apple in the mix that caused that. It wasn't L. Ron Hubbard or me or the system at fault. It was this, what they call in Scientology, this suppressive element.
That seems to follow along with the way sort of Catholicism has managed to exist for as long as it has, because they can just move along with society and blame something else and keep existing.
Yeah, it's the few bad apples argument. Everybody makes it, and it excuses a system of oppression because, well, those are just a few bad apples. See. Right. And sometimes that's right, and sometimes it's wrong, and sometimes it's a mix of both. I'm not making any statements about anything outside of these extremist groups where it's easy to see. In other social situations, it's a little more complicated.
And in some cases, it's valid.
No, and in some cases it is. But I'm just making the point here that, when we're talking about Scientology, that few bad apples argument carries weight, even though logically it doesn't make any damn real sense.
Right.
It's curious that all of these bad apples keep rising through the ranks of the Sea Org, despite apparently this organization having superpowers when it comes to interpersonal relationships. And yet, for some reason, all these terrible people keep getting to levels of leadership. That's so weird.
Yeah, isn't it? It's so bizarre. Yeah. Yes.
How does that keep happening?
But let's be clear about the fact that, that brainwashing, as since we're on this topic, and I love talking about it, is it's not a permanent condition. It's something that requires constant reinforcement. And that is a point that lots and lots of people miss. And that's why you have to keep re-upping You got to keep going to the events. You have to keep showing up. You got to keep contributing. Otherwise, it wears off. And over time, that's why so many people have left Scientology. Because it wears off.
I'd like to think an analogy is like a TV show that everybody's really hyped for. So like Game of Thrones was hugely hyped, and there were so many people watching it, and so many people were talking about it. They were talking about it on social media. They were talking about it in their real life. They were talking about it at their jobs. Like it was all over the place. Families were watching it together. And like in some ways, that's great. In other ways, toxic fandoms are a thing. You can get into a really toxic place if you're just angry at everybody all the time because your theory of what's supposed to happen doesn't happen. And look at how mad everybody got at the last season, right? But then it stopped coming out and it just went away and nobody cared because there was no reinforcement.
All the little girls who are currently like, 4 or 5 who are named Khaleesi or something, they're going to care a little bit.
Maybe, if they figure it out.
Because, whoops. Actually, I do have a question with the it wears off.
My kid Yoshi.
That's a real Japanese name though. That's like an actual Japanese boy's name. That's at least a real name. But with the it wears off. Is that why in Scientology there's the emphasis, especially with people who could more easily leave, to keep them on course? It's like, oh hey, you're not currently taking any courses or working on any certifications. Why is that? Let's sign you up for something.
Yes, absolutely. This is all part of what we call a totalist system. It wants to take total control of your life. All aspects of it, your social life, your professional life, personal, your thoughts, all of it, right? The more totalist, the more intrusive and invasive and less transparency or privacy you're allowed or afforded. And, if there is any, again, in terms of questions people can ask themselves, is there a group or an individual or some entity that I owe complete and total transparency to, and I can't have any privacy or sense of self to this thing? And that's always a huge, huge, huge red flag. So Scientology is constantly pushing for be part of it, participate, come down to the church, 12 and a half hours a week of course time, 15 hours of auditing a week. As a minimum, we must have you here that often every single week. And every time you finish a course, you're down to the salesperson to high intensity sell you on starting the next course right away. No breaks, no stop, no vacation.
I actually noticed that when I kind of started deconverting from Christianity, one of the things that kind of tipped me off on this was when I went to university. I went to a Christian university and I got like red flags because I wouldn't have been allowed to graduate if I didn't attend enough of their services, which didn't work for me.
Yeah, mandatory chapel.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I dropped out was because I was going to church at my own church. So I'm like, so I was traveling back and forth on weekends, which means I was going to miss too many of their services specifically to be able to graduate. So that's one of the reasons I ended up leaving. But it was one of the things that tipped me off to be like, wait, this is school though. These are separate things. Hold on a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's right. I would consider that a pretty big red flag.
No, it falls under the first of what there's this guy, this researcher, back in the day, Robert Lifton, and he listed out these 8 things that are necessary for thought reform or for what we call brainwashing. He was one of the original scientists who actually studied this stuff, and this all falls under what we call milieu control or environmental control. If you can control a person's environment, if you can control where they're at, what they're doing, you got them. It's a really key part of all of this. And so getting your voluntary participation is really, really key at the beginning, but over time they're working you so it's less and less voluntary, but more and more time commitment.
But you still think of it as voluntary, right? Because
that's the thing. It's subtle, right? They're working you. Right. Yeah, it's the boiling frog phenomenon. You're not aware of just how much more your social contacts suddenly are only Scientologists. Your business contacts are gradually only Scientologists. This kind of steady,
they're the only moral
erosion.
people in the world. Of course they would be your only contacts. They're the only moral people in the world, so of course they'd be your only contacts.
Well, exactly. And that's part of the indoctrination. On day 1, you're not thinking that. But by day 20, by day 200, these Scientologists are the only ones who know what they're talking about.
I think
second you're down that road, you're all in. I mean, it's all over for you.
I think one of the only reasons I actually ended up deconverting was because I really did not make any friends at the church.
Community is a vital. No, it's a good point. Community is a vital emotional need that these groups meet.
Yeah, I had a really hard time making friends with anybody like in the church youth group. I didn't really hang out with any of those people outside of just those church youth groups. So I just never got along because I was getting isolated in a whole nother situation. Because my stepdad was crazy. So like I got kind of stuck between two things trying to take advantage of keeping my attention, and neither succeeded because it was older. You could only get one.
Yeah.
Like having competing ones didn't work too well. So does that, like, how does this apply to, do you think, like, political rallies? Because I know, like, a lot of church groups will do, like, their big rally for the youth groups, or they'll do, like, a big rally for the church where they get a bunch of churches together and all do the thing.
Same kind of thing, right?
Does it?
It's a participation activity that reinforces your confirmation bias, right? Gives you that sense of community, tells you you're right for thinking all the things you're thinking, and gives you a dopamine hit at the same time because you get that euphoric awe experience of all these people are all on the same page. And that has biological effects on us, right? That we really crave.
Yeah. That wonder and awe that I looked at a waterfall and felt God moved me. And
that's right.
Except it's tough.
So much of it has to do with the interpretation of that experience for people. In a church setting, it's God touching you or Jesus saving you or you felt the Lord's whatever. In a Scientology setting, it's your Thetan is now, exterior and you're having this wonderful out-of-body experience. And, at a concert, it's everybody's on the same page with the music and they're having this sort of individual experience, but they're all having it collectively, which is why, generally speaking, concerts are good things, not bad things. They're not trying to indoctrinate you at the same time.
Yeah.
So context, again, is everything with this. If you're being instilled with dogma, ideas, beliefs as a result of this awe experience, that is a convincer that very few things can match. People will connect those two things together, the emotion and the dogma, and then it becomes inseparable for them, and that's why they become so emotionally committed to it.
Does this now maybe this is weird, but does this apply to things like when you have, if we're gonna go into the more social and emotional aspects, when all your friends get into something and you're not into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so do you drift away from your friends, or do they end up reinforcing something that maybe you're not that interested in that you begin liking?
It can happen. Depends on the situation, I guess, and the person involved. Not everybody is susceptible to group pressure. I mean, there's one of the most replicated experiments in psychology is the Asch conformity experiments, where they stick people in rooms and make them conform with ridiculous ideas or things, just because the group is most people in the room are going, yeah, that's how it is. And the guy's going, no, it's not. But they're kind of,
you're getting gaslit.
Yeah, it's 60 to 70% of people are gonna go with what the group says, even when it's blatantly wrong.
Well, I think it helps too if there's because sometimes these things are trivial. Like they have no real negative side effects to like anybody else's life. It's not like your friends in high school getting you to play a video game is not going to necessarily ruin your life. It could in an extreme sense, but in general, like if anybody asks you to play League of Legends, don't do it. It's trash.
Wait, Chesh, you play video games?
Shut up.
Have you heard of Super Mario Brothers?
There might be bias here.
Get me out. I'm being bullied by the smarter people in the room.
No, I have to admit, I play some video games too. I totally understand. But anyway, it just, conformity is key, but it's not a clincher. There is no clincher here. You know what I mean? Everybody's their own person, and what's going to work on one person isn't necessarily going to work on another. It's really a matter of just recognizing that we're all susceptible to something or many somethings. And, having enough self-awareness to see when we're sliding into a place where we're no longer questioning, no longer thinking, we're just conforming and accepting. And that's a dangerous place no matter what the dogma or the belief set is.
I
That's all
imagine there's like
there.
a difficult line, or like, at least I shouldn't say a difficult line, a gray line that varies based on an individual. And it's how responsible are you for your own actions? And when you start brainwashing somebody, when you start pressuring somebody, when you start influencing somebody to that degree, you start blurring that line of how responsible they become to a degree. Do you not?
You do into the degree that you can convince them that they are not responsible for their own actions. People are always responsible for their own actions.
Yeah.
Right. We got to be clear about that. Right. It doesn't matter how thoroughly you've been indoctrinated into the Hitler Youth or Scientology or the Sea Org. If you go, assaulting people, that's on you.
Yeah.
But the reasoning for why you would go about doing that might be the result of an intensive amount of, brainwashing or undue influence or coercive control on you. And so you might feel incredibly justified in doing what you're doing. And that's where the lines get a little gray or blurry, I suppose, in terms of intent, but the actions are still the actions. And that's one of the most difficult topics of discussion is the line between victim and victimizer.
Yeah, I find that a lot of victims and victimizers are both. You're both at the same time a lot.
That's right.
And I think that's what, when I say gray, I think it means the way we judge other people, not so much about whether or not you're literally guilty of doing something. You're responsible for your own actions, but whether or not, like, how harshly people are going to judge you is going to vary depending on how much of an explanation you can give, because explanations are not excuses. You're not excused from...
Well, exactly. It's like learning... extreme example to demonstrate the point, right? The Texas Tower shooter, right? He goes and he blows away all these people, completely insane act. Nobody can understand it. They do an autopsy on the guy. Turns out he had a brain tumor the size of a golf ball, right? And you go, holy cow. And then you look in his history and you see journaling and diaries that indicate this guy knew he had a problem, but he didn't know what it was, and a slow descent into madness, resulting in, him going nuts and killing a bunch of people. Well, it's in no way, shape, or form does that excuse his culpability for what he did, but at least now you understand it wasn't because he was evil and twirling his mustache or something. It was because he had a real problem that he wasn't solving and nobody was solving.
And the value to that, isn't necessarily towards that individual. It's towards the rest of us, that we can learn and we can say, hey, now we can look out for these things and maybe we can help the next person who's suffering from this.
Exactly.
And that excuses nothing of the initial behavior.
That's right. Because you still want the guy to have gotten in some help, or like when it gets to that level, you're like, oh my God, you really have crossed over into this line of insanity, and you really wish that there could have been some help earlier that could have headed that off.
And it's one of those things where it's like hindsight's 20/20. It's like, had this person got the help that they needed, would they have ever done what they did? And it's like, well, maybe not, but you could say that about literally anything.
Who knows?
Yeah. Right?
All you can do is your best.
You can't speculate like that. It's just like asking, I think Dapper and I talked about this before. It's like asking, like, well, what if Hitler won? And it's like, you can't, I was talking to Barry about this. Sorry, it wasn't Dapper, it was Barry. I was talking to Barry about this. He's in the side chat. We were saying that you could speculate some things, but you could only go so far before it's just pure, like, fanciful.
And that's actually something that's a big deal in, like, the historian community, where it's like, there's not a whole lot of point in what if speculation when it comes to actual history, right? Because we don't know. Was this war inevitable? Who knows? It happened. That's what we can talk about. And sure, you can always think, well, I wish things had gone other than they did. And that's valid. But on the other hand, you do at some point have to just deal with what did happen and move on from there. You can't spend your whole life like, oh, I wish I had done this other thing. Like, well, that's great. That doesn't change anything. I'm glad that you have regrets, but like we gotta carry on with life as it goes.
That's right.
Yeah.
We got a question from the chat that says, do you think it may be possible that voting and elections and politics may just be to keep us distracted while corporations make all the important decisions?
No.
Yeah, not really. No. Look, there is a whole bunch of undue influence from corporate interests in politics, and that's primarily because lobbying is the best investment you can make as a business. Yes. Your return from lobbying is usually far better than your return from any kind of land deals or futures trade, anything like that. Lobbying is by far your best use of your money in terms of a business. Now, we could propose, reforms to change that and whatnot, but fundamentally, there are differences between candidates that are real and like measurable differences in the things that they want in terms of policy, their voting records, which you can then use to predict what will likely happen if they're elected. And then your vote, while statistically any individual's vote is going to be pretty meaningless, still, collectively, those votes can in fact affect the way things go. So, for instance, there's been a whole bunch of controversial Supreme Court decisions recently in the United States. Well, if the last president had been someone else, those decisions would not have been made because different people would be on the bench. That is a real measurable difference that is the result of an election that has nothing to do, or at least very little to do, with corporate lobbying.
And I think that a lot of people get confused because, or miss out because local elections matter a lot more than what tends to be presented by mainstream media. And so because everything is so big, there's a complete lack of like local media anymore because people just don't find it interesting, which is really too bad because your local elections and what's happening in your local area is hugely important. But also there's a big mistake that politics does, in my opinion, and it relies on your local vote to make decisions for too much. So like in Canada, you've got like your district type vote. Like you've got it's kind of like a governor, but then you've got your local city, then you've got your bigger area, then you've got your province, and then you've got federal. Right, but the way you get federal seats is by getting lower down seats. But your community might do really well with a conservative, but you want a federal liberal. But you have to vote for the liberal in your local area if you want liberal federal. So like I think that's a problem. I'm not a fan of that, but it's annoying.
Well, it's not how it is here. I don't know. We pay a lot of attention to our local stuff. I mean, we always read our ballot things, and I mean, I'm talking about me, my household here. We pay a lot of attention to that stuff. We were watching the local stuff very closely last night, as well as the national stuff. But yeah, an awareness of that is absolutely crucial. And I guess to the question, also, I'd like to say that there are chasms of difference between systemic problems and how individuals or groups, small groups, can use a system or misuse a system. Yes. And those are two different things. When you have temporary problems or short-term problems or issues with an individual or group of individuals misusing or abusing a system, you can easily blame the system itself, say the system is wrong, the system needs to be changed, when that's not really the problem at all. On the other hand, you can do the reverse too, right? You can miss systemic issues by blaming individuals. It takes an awful lot of looking and investigating to really get to the heart of which one you're dealing with here.
I think that's why people say
sovereign citizens, they'll tell you all about how the whole system needs to be dismantled. If you listen to certain other ideologies, they are all about revolutionary thinking and Marx had it right and we need to down with the systems and it's all the systems. And you're like, that's not really how people work, and it's not going to work. And I really wish you'd stop saying that, but
I think that's the argument you see with Trump, right? People saying that Trump is a symptom of the problem, not a problem itself. Whereas it's like, no, I'm pretty sure Trump is also just a problem.
Trump is the problem. Yeah, no, Trump himself is layers of problems.
You can have both
like an
a
onion.
problematic system as well as a problematic person within that system who has problems regardless of the fact that he's part of the system with problems. That can all compound. But actually, you brought up the
and
sovereign
that's
citizen.
why it's complicated. That's
Yeah. Speaking of sovereign citizens, I mean,
defies. I guess all I'm trying to say is it defies reductionist thinking, but people are constantly trying to reduce it, and it just doesn't work that way.
It's not intuitive.
I get a little frustrated about that.
Yeah.
Imagine.
Now, you mentioned the sovereign citizens, and I think we've recently had on very public display just how crazy that movement can get, and also how absurd all their legal theories are. Do you think that is something that's primarily spreading through brainwashing? Because I have trouble imagining that someone is just rationally coming to this understanding of how the legal code works, where it's like, oh, there's an eagle on the flag, so you're under admiralty law now, and you're not really a citizen of the state in which you reside. Like, come on, man.
No,
how does any of that get into your brain?
Yeah, it tends to. I've actually done podcasts on sovereign citizens, and as far as I can tell from the analysis we've done, it's economic financial desperation of the lower classes who tend to go for that. It's a reductionist, simplistic way of thinking about very complicated problems by people who don't have a lot of cognitive ability to think through those difficult problems, nor the time or resources to do so. They're not making their car payments. They're not making their insurance payments. They can't afford to keep their car, but they need their car to get to their job. What do? Adopt a crazy idea that the government never had any right to interfere with their car in the first place, and feel they get a great big ego boost on that.
Right.
And join a community of people, again, cognitive bias, right? And confirmation bias and group community support. And they'll adopt, crazy ideas because they believe they have very good reasons to believe these ideas.
Right.
And that's what I see as sort of an origin story for most sovereign citizens.
Does the same kind of idea apply to police auditing?
I'm sorry, to police what?
Auditing? Like the people who go around and shove cameras in the police officers' faces?
Maybe. I mean, maybe in some cases. I think you have a variety of ideas going on there. I mean, I don't know that it's such a bad idea to shove a camera in a police officer's face sometimes,
I just wonder
I don't want to
blanket
judge that.
No. I just
activity.
mean like from the same kind of line of thinking where it's like people who are frustrated and are sick of whatever's going on, because that's not always necessarily a bad thing. Being desperate generally leads you to poor decision making, but isn't in and of itself a bad. You're not wrong for being desperate, right? Like you're not doing anything bad by being there. So I'm like I can see in some ways it could lead to something positive or something that is generally a good idea versus leading to something that is just reductive and ends up hurting you in the long run.
Yeah. Well, I think you also have, like, it's easy. It's easy to tell a police officer or, pick up your phone or a camera or whatever and point it at somebody. It's a lot harder to go figure out, how do I write a bill that changes this at a legal level? How do I go and create an activity or organize a group of people that force some police reform in my area? How do I get on boards or get into situations, or who do I need to meet and talk to influence this situation so that I can reform or change it? That's hard. That's really hard.
Yeah.
Way easier, way faster, and
way
more emotionally satisfying to just, hey, Mr. Police Officer, I'm going to follow you around and film you all day, kind of thing, I think.
I'm wondering, and I'm also curious to know, like, how helpful that is in general, right? Because it's like, maybe in some ways to bring awareness is something that's valuable, but in other ways it's like, but what does awareness do if nobody's doing anything about it?
Yeah, tell me about it. I got exposed cults all day, right? That's like, how much actually gets done about it? Well,
help me.
Well, to some extent, awareness is always going to come before action, because no one's going to take action unless they know that there's a problem to be addressed. And I think
Yeah, of course.
in the case of, especially things like the problems with the police, it's only been recently that there's been enough like ubiquitous availability of things like cameras that can take video and whatnot, that people could even be aware that there's so
That's
many
right.
widespread problems with police behavior in the United States and other countries too, but it's a big problem in the United States. And so I think to some extent we are still just into some degree in the people don't always know that there are these things going on, that the police are routinely violating people's rights, and that they're
Yes.
just generally all of that, the brutality, the use of deadly force in circumstances where it was absolutely not warranted. And I think that to some extent, yeah, we're still in the people need to know about this kind of phase, because until enough people know that it's a problem, no one's going to care, right? If you tell people like, "Oh, hey, have you heard about the new additive in the water?" and then everyone's just like, "No," well, they're not going to do anything, even if it is a problem. It's the same thing here, and I think to some extent with at least some cults, it's the same thing, right? If people don't like why is it that right now Scientology's new recruits are basically drying up? People just don't want to join. Well, it's because now they know. In
Exactly.
1992, people
it's
didn't know.
really important. Yeah, it is. Exposure is absolutely the first level of change, and it's very, very important we do this. It's hard work doing it.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it's work that is absolutely vital to be done, and I can say from a position of knowledge on this that it matters. It really does. It's not useless activity. It just feels like it sometimes. We have already created massive changes within the Church of Scientology without them even admitting that that's what we did. They've dropped things. They've dropped abusive practices. They've stopped doing things they used to do. And the only logical reason for them to have done that is because of the exposure. So it does matter.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you see things like
and
that with
they're not even as litigious anymore.
You see that with things like
correct.
Joel Osteen during the flood, right? Joel Osteen got externally pressured into opening his church doors to help people who were in danger and help people who were in a bad place because of the flooding. Right? Like, this dude had a massive megachurch and was preaching about helping people and then didn't open his doors. And because people flipped out and lost their shit on him on Facebook and Twitter and were just like, bro, what the hell are you doing? Those doors fucking opened.
That's right. That's right. No, public shaming absolutely has its place. And exposure absolutely has its place. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't is when you really have to start wondering, wait a minute, what the hell's going on here? We're exposing, and nothing's changing. And that's when you have to dig in harder and find out what's keeping it from changing.
I think you find a little bit more of that when you start looking at problematic corporations. So like Nestle.
Yeah.
People have been mad and sick of Nestle, particularly people who live in areas where Nestle operates, where Nestle is just California. There's a place in Quebec. There's a city in Ontario called Ayr. Was it Ayr? There's a city nearby that all have had problems because Nestle wants to do fracking, or Nestle wants to do this, or Nestle wants access to that. And but there hasn't been there was a lawsuit in Quebec, the province, not the city, that it was years because the Nestle was trying to tap into the underground water there, and the city told them no because a lot of the city, like the locals, used well water, and if they tapped into that water, they would contaminate all of the local wells. And so there was a lawsuit that went on for almost a decade, and they finally won, and it went all the way up the line. But how many people even know about it?
Right.
Right? And so Nestle's been a problem for ages, but there either isn't enough exposure, or Nestle has enough money to prevent whatever government change, and they've been succeeding thus far. Because it's a balance, right? You have to have so much exposure and so much negative that it outweighs whatever Nestle is doing to maintain their position.
That's right.
Weird. Brainwashing.
It's hard because also people only have, I mean, the other end of that is people only have so much bandwidth for so much.
Yeah.
There's only so many
you can't be
problems
concerned with everything.
And I think brainwashing takes advantage of that, right? It takes advantage of people being burned out or people not having the time or the energy to invest in whatever it is you may or may not be trying to convince them to do.
Yeah, I have a hard time calling that brainwashing. I think that's just life. I think that's just people. They only have so much attention for so many things.
No, I just mean I think they take advantage of it. Like that's a thing that exists, but I think that's a point of a disadvantage to an individual trying to avoid being convinced. Because sometimes you just get told something and it sticks in your brain, but it's like in the back because you're not worried about it. And then it comes up again, and then it comes up again, and it comes up again because you don't have time, right? And so people don't care because they don't have the time or the energy. And that's not anything wrong. That's okay. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's just people being people.
It's just life, man. You're just an animal. You're just a monkey. There's only so much you can do. It's okay. Except for Dapper, who's a dinosaur. I don't know where that puts him on the totem pole.
I just go away from the totem pole. Like you crazy apes can do your crazy ape stuff. I don't have to worry about any of that.
Oh, okay.
Wow, that must be nice.
There you go.
All right, well, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. We got off topic, and I love it when we do because it only comes up with it comes up with more topics to talk about down the line. Links are in the description for every down below. This has been Chris Shelton and Dapper Dinosaur. There are links again also down below. Feel free to become a member and join in on the Discord. You can become a member on Patreon, or you can become a member on the YouTube channel itself if you feel free you want to join us in that Discord. It's ridiculous and silly in there. Also find us on Twitter while it lasts. The links are also down below. What do you guys want to shill? What do you got going on?
Check out my channel. I don't know that I particularly modeled it here, but I do consulting as well. So, if people need help with cultic situations, family, friends, recovery, anything like that, they can always contact me for that, as well as the library.
Deconstruction is huge and a really difficult and complicated situation. We should talk about. You need to come back and we'll talk about that one.
Yeah, I'd love to, because that would maybe be more conducive to that conversation or me pimping that. But that is something I do. So I'll throw that out there, as well as, of course, the extensive library of content on my channel.
I would love to get you on with John Steingard. Because that'd be good. Sorry, go ahead, Dapper. My brain is ticking in other directions.
No, it's fine. For me, shilling tomorrow at the same time that this show started, I'm going to be premiering a video about what the fossil record can reveal us, in which a man tries to spew a whole bunch of nonsense about fossils, and I correct that with some actual. I do things like I actually look at actual papers from paleontology journals and things like that. Imagine that, getting well-sourced information. How crazy is that?
It sounds like you've had a little bit too much to think, Mr. Dinosaur.
On the 12th, again at the same time as this show happened, I'm going to be doing. I'm hoping actually that we can continue our tract reading exercise. I don't know if Chesh is up for it, but we have an entire homophobic and anti-Semitic creationist comic book to read through.
Yay.
So it's going to be amazing because, the villain of the comic book is in fact a gay-coded man who looks like the Happy Merchant, if you're familiar with that particular anti-Semitic cartoon. It's frankly kind of amazing that it even exists, because it's just like, holy crap. But so that's going to be... But also, it has some of the best cover art for any comic book I've ever seen, which is so disappointing because it's such a waste.
It looks so good. Why is this here?
It really does. I'm hoping that we can get the crew back together. So assuming that we can, that'll be me and Bent, Hovind, and Chesh, and Vishanti. And the four of us are, my tract reading crew. They help keep me sane because that way I don't have to read literally everything there. And that's about as far ahead as the 15th, I'm hoping I can get Science Side Up, Maddie, back on for talk about, I think we're still doing Matt Powell.
Yeah, you're
Because,
still talking about
goodness.
Matt Powell.
Well, I mean, it's just him or Raw Matt, and they're both worse than the other. So,
Oh, yeah.
what are you going to do? Matty drew the short stick with having a name that worked well with Matt. So, oh well. But yeah, that's about as far ahead as I want to look. You guys know that I usually have 3 shows a day or a week, so stop by.
Yeah, go and find
Awesome.
their links down below. I will be back on Friday with another Debate Hub. We will be back with Landon Kirtnell, and Manya's taking a break from her break to join us for tracking the volcano and Mount Pele and what had happened last month and what's going on this month, because there's been some tremors going on. We will see you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.